Thank you very much for asking me to present. Just by way of introduction, my name is Stuart Lee. As you can see, I'm the Reader in E-Learning and Digital Libraries at the University of Oxford. And I have a couple of roles. One is I run the computing services and run major digitisation projects and things like that. But I also teach English literature. So I'm wearing two hats here as a researcher, but also someone who comes from IT. And I thought I'd try and just think back a bit about how, when I was a researcher, I started to use digital technologies. So just to sort of help you, going way back into the 80s, when I was a graduate student at King's College London doing medieval English literature of all things, they were quite pioneering, and they trained new graduates in how to use these new computing tools. And the story I often say is that my thesis was preparing an edition. I won't bore you about the details of that, but one of the components of that was to produce a glossary at the end. So this was a word list of everything that had appeared in the original text that I was editing. And the way that students used to do this was they would find the first word in the text they were editing, they would write it on a card, then they would go to the second word, they check they hadn't already written that on a card, they would write a new card, then they would go to the third word, and so on. And this could take a long time, and indeed a colleague of mine who preceded me, it took him about a year and a half to do this. But what happened with me was I was quite lucky. I was trained in a program called Word Cruncher, which is a text analysis tool, and I could produce an index, and it took me about 3 hours to do this. Needless to say, my friend never spoke to me again, but even back in the 80s, it showed to me just how much these things could help you in terms of doing your research, and this was, as I said, just an eye-opener. And just to take the story forward a few years, in the mid-90s I was asked to publish my thesis, and I was going through a long process of trying to produce a monograph as part of an academic publication series. But I never got round to it because of my work, and I also realised that probably this would have about a sale of about 100, 150 to some major research libraries, and that was about it. So I took the step at the time of producing a PDF of my thesis, and there it is, I'm not expecting you to understand it, and putting it on the web. Now at the time I didn't know this was open publishing. I just put my thesis on the web, I added some information and left it up there. And what again has struck me is this has probably been read or downloaded thousands of times, and has made my reputation in this particular field something which I probably wouldn't have achieved in book form. So going back in my history then, you know, I've been using IT in my research in the humanities for some time, and I've kind of seen the potential. So let me just say a few words about the researcher in the humanities though, because I know you're going to hear a presentation from someone in the sciences. The first thing which I would like to say, and it's quite important for the humanities, is we like to use old stuff. This image here you're seeing is an exam paper from the 19th century. That is fascinating to me from my discipline, and indeed I fully expect to be going to journals from the 19th century and the early 20th century, because it's important for me to access that information, because some of those articles have stood the test of time. It's not the case in the humanities that we would only be looking at material, say, from the last 10 years or so, and prior to that it really only has some minor historical of interest. The other thing to say is that we never really finish anything in the humanities. This life cycle of research comes from the Pseudo-Me project, supporting data management infrastructure for the humanities, which was based at Oxford. And it's interesting, and it takes you through the various steps. But one of the things that they came out when they were talking to a lot of researchers in humanities is that these projects can have a very, very long lifespan, and they're never really completed. You often come back and revisit them. So it is very much an iterative stage, or cycle I should say, in your research. And I like the phrases that were coming up in terms of humanities research: unbounded, incomplete, inconsistent, interpreted. So it really is a process of coming back, revisiting and reworking the material. You don't just publish it, then move on to the next thing. So what I thought I'd try and do is start thinking about the modern researcher, or the researcher in the humanities, and try to make a few points which I think are pertinent to how IT can help them. Most importantly, the obvious difference is we tend to work by ourselves. We're the lone scholar. We sit there, we do our thing, and we do it in our way. We're not in labs working in a field or a team of other people. And that obviously manifests itself in publishing. To us, again, and it goes back to this old thing, print is very important. And a report which I thought was extremely good, the RAN report 2011 on reinventing research, picked this up in terms of their analysis. We still often go back to print material, and this could be centuries old, or it could be at least decades old. And the chances of that material becoming digital are not that good. Who will be investing in all of this in the future? We use a lot of bibliographies and catalogues, and that mainly leads us to what we call primary and secondary source material. But really what we're just trying to find is useful stuff, things which we think is just going to help us with our research. When we mass this together, we present our argument and we produce our publication at the end. And increasingly, and I think this is certainly with modern researchers, they're less worried about where this stuff comes from. They're just really interested in finding something useful to them. And it could be of any media, and the source, they will probably check where the provenance of the material, but really all they're interested in is getting useful material together. And the other thing is that what we're often searching when our archives that we're looking at are things which are built by the higher education sector themselves. They're built by academics or libraries and museums. A lot of projects from the AHRC or academics are going assembling material and are producing research archives for other people to then use. And this was something which I've been doing with material related to the First World War. Of course, we will analyse data and we use tools. Some of the tools have nothing to do with computers, but increasingly more and more. So we're editing stuff, we're manipulating material, we're analysing, we're comparing data and so on. And increasingly, really going back to our training, what we're trying to do is organise our material so that we can quickly find it, so that it's there, we know we can go back and look it up and then come back to it and use it in assembling our material. We have to present our scholarly work as every academic does in every discipline. We deliver our argument, we combine our primary and secondary source material, we use monographs and academic journals again, as many people would do in other disciplines. Citation is important to us, but possibly it's nowhere near as important as in other disciplines. What we tend to look for is peer recognition, the knowledge that your name is known in your discipline, and that is very important. That may not necessarily be a citation, it may just be a reputation thing. It's quite a hard thing to pin down. And also what we require is that the material that we produce is safeguarded, is archived, so that we can then come back to it, as I said, about this life cycle, but more importantly that other people can. As with every academic discipline, what we're seeking to do here is build on the knowledge produced by other people. But for us, we want that material to be around for a long, long, long time. In some of the science subjects, medical sciences, obviously it goes out of date because the next stage of research supersedes that and builds on it and moves forward. But we're looking at material, things that were transcribed or authored decades and, as I said, centuries ago. Now, you could say, what's new about all this? That's just a general description of humanities research. Where are the challenges? So let's start to think about some of the things which are perhaps coming up because of the new technologies. And to start on a positive note, what are the opportunities these things are bringing towards us? Well, one good thing, and it shouldn't be overlooked, is the fact that we've got a lot of other things now to research, because we're not just researching our discipline, but we have all these new disciplines surrounding the use of IT and humanities research, which crosses other disciplines. So we're interested in digitization methods, we're interested in metadata, we're interested in resource discovery, and so on. So hey-ho, a whole new academic field has opened up to us, and we're willing to pitch in like the best of them. What it allows us to do, of course, bringing it back to the focus of the research, is we can do things which previously might have been proved impossible. My example, right at the beginning of doing something in a few hours, which took my colleague a year to do. But we can find material quickly, we can deal with mass quantities of information, and that's something outside of a field like corpus linguistics the humanities isn't particularly good at or isn't particularly disciplined in. We often tended to focus on small amounts of information, but there are some areas, as I said, corpus linguistics or historical research, where they are looking across mass quantities, but that isn't the norm across everywhere. We can achieve low-cost distribution. On a previous slide, I showed you a screenshot from iTunes U. That to us is important in terms of disseminating our scholarly work, or at least information about it, or tools like that. And we've got storage, that's no longer a problem. So if we do want to assemble vast quantities of information that we might be drawing on, that isn't technically an issue or financially as much an issue. We can search across things. These new tools allow us to move across from our desk and with associated resources linked in. So what I'm trying to say here is that the new tools may allow you to branch out from your focusing, in my case, perhaps on literature, and suddenly I would be taken into an archive to do with history or archaeology or art and so on. And it may be from a one-stop aggregated search engine. So this is very good. What we perhaps undervalue, and I'm not certain this is being picked up exactly in the new tools, is serendipity. One of the great things of going into a library, flicking through a card catalogue or scanning your eye along the books is you may know the article or the journal or the book that you want, but what you didn't know were the books either side, and you suddenly, oh, that's interesting, I didn't know someone had written that, because they're usually based around a theme. So there is an element of that which is something which we're all quite interested in retaining. There are a lot of chances now for collaboration using online tools. I'm sure everyone would say that that's true. But one thing which is particular to the humanities, this may well be in other disciplines, but it's certainly, I would observe it in the humanities, is that we work very much in our subdomain. So I would know people at Oxford who work in early medieval literature, and I would know other people around the world who work in early medieval literature. I may not necessarily know who is working in 20th century literature at Oxford or Victorian literature. So our domains, our networks are international, but they're based around our particular subdomain. And that's where we tend to work well, that's where we collaborate, and that's where we're very willing to collaborate. We're less inclined to do so if it's some sort of generic contribute to the overall well-being of the humanities, I think. We can have better monitoring of data use, of people using the material we produce. And of course, technology is advancing all the time. New tools are coming out, even in a sort of basic organizational bibliographic tools such as Mendeley. You know, we're beginning to sort of use that and see the potential there. So all good things happening there. When we consider the problems, though, there are a few. And what I thought I would do is focus on the challenges based around those sort of 4 steps I talked about earlier on about being a researcher, but also just some general questions. I mean, one of the key questions which you may be discussing today is, who is a researcher? I mean, in the old days you could say it was an academic, perhaps even you might tie it to their contract, but now we're seeing the public doing research, we're seeing corporate enterprises doing research. It's gone beyond that, and I think that is a challenge for libraries, because whereas they traditionally knew in the academic sector who their market was, now they're having to accommodate people beyond the sphere of higher education. In the Reinventing Research, they pointed to a few things which I would agree with entirely. There is a general lack of awareness of resources. There's so much appearing, people find it difficult to keep track. There is a lack of standardization. I was amazed. I did a project in the 90s and we were talking about cataloging and standardization and image formats, etc. And then I revisited that project with a subsequent thing 10 years later, and hey ho, people were still talking about metadata standards and image standards, and no one seemed to have sort of solved this, which is rather disappointing. Going back to my example of when I was a graduate and I used WordCrunch for a text analysis tool, 1988, I think if you looked at most text analysis tools from now, they haven't advanced much in 20 years. And the other thing was inadequate training. We're training our graduates in all kinds of things, but are we really training them as much as they need to know in how to use IT for all kinds of things? And I'll come back to that. And this was picked up also by the Oxford project, the Pseudo-Me project, really about people needed training in a particular area. And what they were particularly looking at here in Pseudo-Me was how people manage their data. They were identifying that really people didn't know how to back up or hadn't quite grasped why this might be important, and issues of sustainability.